Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Versosa. I'm the Executive Director and Curator here at Stanley-Whitman House. Welcome to our Conversation Club. We're looking forward to having this discussion with Gail White-Usher. We're thrilled to present the series When Two Worlds Met, Indigenous Peoples of Northeast America. Gail White-Usher will tell about the exploration of the complex interwoven narratives of Indigenous peoples and Europeans from 1500 to 1750. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land that we're here on in Farmington, Connecticut. We'd like to pay our respects to the Indigenous peoples past and present who have stewarded this land through the generations. Stanley-Whitman House is dedicated to recognizing, honoring, and learning from the rich cultures, histories, and insights of Indigenous peoples. We at Stanley-Whitman House acknowledge that we are situated in the homeland of the Tungus people, who later invited the Mohegan, Wangunk, Quinnipiac, and other displaced Native people to join them here. Today, 5 nations, the Mohegan, Pashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shaktacook, and Golden Hill Pagusset, and the descendants of other Native peoples continue to serve as stewards of this land. With this acknowledgement, we recognize the legacies of settler colonialism, and we signal ongoing commitment to building relationships with the Indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands almost 15,000 years into the future nations. This acknowledgement is a step in our ongoing commitment to fostering inclusivity, respect, and mutual understanding. Again, we're delighted to have Gail White-Usher here to present the first of 7 monthly programs. Gail is a distinguished educator and researcher, specializing in New England's early history, with her insights centering on the intricate relationships between Native American and European immigrant women in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Her fascination with the dynamic interactions between these two worlds will certainly foster enriching conversations. Gail's extensive knowledge and unique perspective are grounded in her roles as the education coordinator for Historic New England, chair of the Woodstock Historic District Commission, and president of Chamberlain Mill. Tonight, we'll explore the pivotal interactions between European explorers and the Indigenous peoples of North America, utilizing original materials like documents, maps, drawings, and surviving objects to delve into the impactful events that shaped the continent. The repercussions of these initial interactions resonate to this day, and our series aims to explore these events in depth, fostering a deeper understanding of this controversial and complex era. This series of discussions is rooted in the tradition of the Conversation Club, formed in 1818 in Farmington, Connecticut. Much like its inspiration, our club aims to discuss the leading issues of the day, making new ideas and perspectives accessible, prompting meaningful dialogue and reflection, helping us envision the future. Thank you for joining us. I will note that this program will be recorded and available on the museum's YouTube channel at a later date. Let's warmly welcome Gail White-Usher as she leads us in telling untold stories and unearthing the lost voices from When Two Worlds Met. Please enjoy the conversation. Gail?
Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you all for joining in this conversation today. I speak to you from land that has been home to Indigenous people for at least 13,000 years. For at least 2,000 years, it has been the home of the Nipmuc Nation people. And for the past 1,000 years, the land has been home to the Wapquasit people, members of the Nipmuc Nation. I am grateful to call this land my home. Over the next 7 months, it will be my pleasure to introduce you to a very complicated time in North American history, a time that established the social and political structure of our current lives. Each month, I will address a different topic. Indigenous peoples of Northeast America before 1492, When Two Worlds Met, Through European Eyes, Trade Lists, Indigenous women in the Northeastern American contact period, art in everyday items, and foodways, Beyond Three Sisters. Each talk will be an introduction to the complex and expanding story of Indigenous people in what we now call Northeast America. With only 40 minutes, there will not be time for an exhaustive or detailed examination of a particular subject, but it's my hope that from my introductions, you will want to learn more and begin your own studies. Connecticut has two excellent museums, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum in Ledyard and the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington. Many of the regional tribes have websites with details of their individual histories. Research is ongoing, and excellent scholarly works are published on a regular basis. For at least the past 25 years, greater and greater attention has been focused on expanding our understanding of the story of the first peoples of the Americas. Dated assumptions and accepted history are being replaced with new understandings and perspectives growing out of fresh collaboration with Indigenous people. Words that have been used, sometimes for centuries, are being replaced with better terminology that reflects new learning and shows respect. These will in turn change as new knowledge and perspectives emerge. Some of the terminology I will use will be new to you. Some may seem rooted in the past. My goal is to respectfully use words to present a very complicated and sensitive subject. In the last days of my mother-in-law's life, she revealed that she was Lenape. She told my husband that his favorite grandfather had come to the United States from Canada as a young man at the end of the 19th century. She said that her father and all his family and ancestors were Lenape. That revelation started a nearly 40-year journey to understand a newly revealed history. My husband was a historian and researcher who focused on the 18th century colonial period. This information immediately expanded the scope of his work and over time completely changed its focus. New information prompts new questions. Each round of questions takes us further back in time in search of understanding and context. This series of talks is just one of the products of our work. Current scholarship points to the first humans coming to North America as long as 25,000 years ago, traveling across Beringia and down through Western Canada and skirting the glaciers to more temperate lands. These footprints that you see on the screen on the right-hand side were recently found in White Sands, New Mexico. They are radiocarbon dated to 21 to 23,000 years ago. Northeast America was firmly locked in the Ice Age. The area now called Connecticut was under a glacier that at its peak was 2 miles deep. About 15,000 years ago, the Earth's temperatures began to moderate, and the glacier slowly receded over hundreds of years. As it receded, it transformed the shape of the land, creating valleys, hills, and its melting ice filled rivers and lakes. For hundreds of years, the land had a frigid Arctic climate, tundra with mosses, lichens, and stunted shrubs. And the blue line on the map here indicates the extent of the ice 15,000 years ago. Gradually, a subarctic climate developed, park-like woodland with stunted fir, birch, and spruce. Flora and fauna diversified and increased. Arctic grasslands attracted mammoths, mastodons, giant moose, caribou, elk, and giant beavers. And humans followed, moving east and north from the settled middle of the continent. And here, 13,000 years ago, you see the blue line indicating the glaciers receding. The people who lived here were hunter-gatherers, establishing a pattern of subsistence settlement and social organization with hunting and tool-making camps that endured for thousands of years. Tools were stone, bone, wood, and shell. Over time, they improved their tool-making skills and the ways they functioned as a social community. The illustrations here on the top are a variety of New England fluted points. And the term fluting means the cleft that's there at the center of the points, which is the point at which it is hafted, as you see in the bottom illustration, onto a spear shaft. Addles also developed around this time. Now, they're essentially throwing sticks with a handle on one end and a hook on the other that can hold either a spear or a dart, and a dart is an elongated arrow. By drawing the spear thrower back and then hurling it forward, a hunter can use the addle as a lever to launch a spear, sending it farther and with more power than if launched only by hand. And on the right side of the screen, the top three horizontal sections are fragments of addles that have been recovered in the New England region. The lower piece, the lower section, is a reproduction of an addle. The current earliest known Connecticut settlement was 12,500 years ago, just up the road in Avon along the Farmington River. This site is located on, and I'll quote directly here, on a deeply buried Pleistocene levee on the Farmington River. It is the oldest dated occupied site in Connecticut and the only site in the American Northeast with well-defined, stratified early Paleo-Indian deposits. Close quotes, the Avon Historical Society. It's the Brian Jones Paleo-Indian site, again, dated to 12,500 years ago. Thousands of artifacts have been removed from this site. It was an established tool-making camp. And on the left, you'll see an assortment of some of the items that have been uncovered at the site. Now, gradually, the climate continued to moderate, and by 8,500 years ago, coniferous and deciduous forests predominate. As the grasslands disappeared and a wetter environment took its place, the mastodons, mammoths, giant beavers, and giant moose disappeared, replaced with deer, bear, moose, smaller animals, including a smaller beaver, and birds. Rivers and lakes were filled with salmon, shad, and other fish. Designs for hunting tools then became more specialized to be more effective in hunting the different sized animals. And this is an assortment of points that have been uncovered in southern New England, dating from about 8,000 years ago at the latest. And you can see the finer working that has become involved as they become stemmed, barbed, and notched to better fit the type of hunting weapons being used. Archery likely spread across North America 6,000 years ago. This is about the same time that the climate stabilized and the full range of modern flora and fauna established itself in all its wonderful diversity. Over the next 2,000 years, this allows for the indigenous people to build more stable settlements and refine their ways of life. Coastal oceans, shallows, and lakes teem with life. Fishing weir technology is developed. Now, fishing weirs are structures that are erected in the shallower waters of a river, a lake, or an estuary, streams. They are all over New England. You can, as the water on particular dry times of year, you can find some of the stone weirs, and we'll talk a little bit about those later. But the purpose of a fishing weir is to herd fish into a confined area to make catching them much easier. Now, this is a diorama that was made to depict the oldest known fishing weir in New England. It dates to 2500 BC. It's the Boylston Fish Weir in Boston. It covers approximately 2 acres, and it's comprised of 65,000 stakes that have been driven into the sediment, with rush placed between all of the stakes to trap the fish. Archery becomes established in the Northeast about 2,500 years ago, and tool making continues to become more specialized and more precise. Again, arrowheads from between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago from southern New England. And you can see the refinement in the detailed work and the napping technology that's being used to create these points. Now, this is around the time when that it is likely that corn and maize reach this region. As maize culture becomes established as a reliable way to feed people, agricultural settlements are established in areas with fertile ground and abundant wildlife, birds and fish. In southern New England, agriculture becomes the main method of providing food, supplemented by hunting and fishing. Northern New England, with its shorter growing season, agriculture then supplements hunting and fishing. Now, we often think of people of the past as more primitive, less capable than we are. We think back to depictions of indigenous societies in older museum dioramas, in films, in television shows, in documentaries. Even the words that are used to describe peoples of the past can convey this subtle message. I suppose it's part of every era's conceit that it is the most advanced, the most intelligent. Our own children can't imagine how we Luddites functioned without computers and mobile phones. I'd like to shift our perspective slightly and look at the people of the past in the context of how they lived and of their technology. 600 years ago, the indigenous people of the Northeast were masters of their environment. Over 13,000 years, they had invented, developed, and perfected tools and techniques and a way of life that allowed them to flourish in the land, in communities with foundations of kinship, cooperation, respect, and compassion. And they accomplished this without the wheel and without metal. They built sophisticated societies that ranged from small communities of related families to villages, to cities containing a number of connected communities, to confederacies. Their world included art, craftsmanship, music, spirituality, well-developed language, diplomacy, negotiation, and trade. The communities were flexible enough to adapt to most challenges. Families, extended families, and communities cared for everyone in their circle. Just what could they do, these people who made their tools from materials found in nature, like stone, bone, and wood? Well, they did not have chainsaws or metal axes that could cut down trees but they were still able to fell a tree using a method that combined burning and scraping. Men built a fire around the base of the desired tree, letting it burn for a time. Then they moved the fire aside, and with stone axes, gouges, and chisels, they scraped away the burned outer part of the tree. Then they rebuilt the fire and repeated the process until the tree was ready to be toppled. They had no power tools, but they perfected the use of fire and stone tools to build dugout canoes. A tree of suitable size was toppled and trimmed, the bark removed. Then small fires were built along its length. The fires burned down into the tree. Now, just like the method that was used to fell the tree, fires were removed and the burn material scraped away with stone gouges and chisels. This was repeated until the interior of the canoe was formed. This is one of the oldest dugout canoes. This one found in New Hampshire. The oldest from the Northeast is 700 years old, and it was discovered in a lake, submerged in a lake in Maine. The oldest known dugout canoe in North America is 3,000 years old, and it was discovered fairly recently in a lake, submerged in a lake in Wisconsin. And this is a Southern New England stone gouge. And this is a stone adze from Massachusetts. Both of these are tools that would be used to scrape away the charred material that was formed as fires burned the tree. They had no sawmills to cut lumber, but had the stone tools and the skill to peel thick bark, elm bark, and thin birch bark from trees. The elm bark was used to cover the frame for their homes. Sometimes thickly woven mats were used alternatively. In both cases, the outer bark and the mat coverings were laid onto the frame in a manner that would prevent wind, weather, and snow from penetrating into the interior of the home. And this is a replica of an elm bark covered wigwam. This one in the one of the Iroquois museums. Beginning about 3,000 years ago, they used the peeled birch bark to build canoes, boats up to 24 feet long that were watertight. The frames were usually of cedar soaked in water and bent to the shape of the canoe. The joints were sewn with spruce or white pine roots. Spruce or pine resin was used to seal the canoe seams so they did not leak. And the bark was peeled so deftly that it did not kill the tree. The skills required to build birch bark canoes were passed on through generations of master builders. Women wove mats from reeds, coarser and thicker to cover the homes, finer for interior wall coverings, somewhat like wallpaper, and for floor coverings. These interior mats added extra insulation to the homes in the winter. Now, they did not have cloth, but thousands of years ago, they had discovered and perfected the technique to soften animal skins to make clothing. Brain tanning deer, moose, and elk skin created a material that was supple and most likely comfortable on most occasions. That the skin could be tanned with the fur left on or the fur removed. And the image on the right shows two women working to prepare the skin prior to brain tanning. The process is fairly amazing. The skin is first put on a frame and stretched, and then the inside of the skin is completely clean, scraped completely clean, either using stone scrapers like you see on the left-hand side of the screen or bone scrapers. Once that's done, then the brain of the animal is mashed into a paste and completely applied onto the skin and allowed to saturate into the skin. And it's one of those amazing coincidences that the brain of the animal is exactly the amount that is needed to do this to the skin, to create a soft and supple skin. regardless of the size of the animal. The brain paste is left on the skin for a period of time, and then it's rinsed away in a stream or lake. And then the hide itself, the skin is restretched and put on the frame so that it will dry straight rather than curling. And clothing was constructed with awls and needles, sewn really with awls and needles that were made of animal and bird bone, and thread made of deer sinew. And here we have 3 examples of bone awls and needles. Frequently, the holes were punched into the skin first with an awl, and then needles threaded with sinew were used to sew the garments together. The people perfected hunting, fishing, farming, and food preservation techniques. They used fire to shape the landscape, forest burns to clear the land of undergrowth, which accomplished several things. First of all, it created havens for wildlife. In fact, the grasslands that were created in parts of Western Pennsylvania and New York were such that bison were enticed into those areas. And for a period of time, bison were found in Western Pennsylvania and parts of New York. But the cleared land also was used for farming and for settlements. Hunting, whether from small groups hunting mastodons with spears to choreographed hunting of cultivated herds of deer, or the skilled hunting of turkeys by individuals, was a man's prime way to provide for his family. Now, the drawing here, which was done in the early 1600s, shows a group of men on the left-hand side. You'll see them, and they are camouflaged, using deer skins as camouflage to approach a group of deer. What I like to tell the students that I'm speaking with is that deers have great vision. Those long ears are good for picking up all kinds of sounds, and then also a good sense of smell. And those combined 3 senses enable them to easily pick out something that doesn't belong around them. And once scared, any hunter knows that once a herd of deer has been scared away from an area, it's several days before they'll come back into that area. So the camouflaging with a deer skin, including with the head on and the deer itself not cleaned so that to mask the man's smell, was one of their techniques for successful hunting. Another method they used was a lot like weir fishing. They constructed barricades, fencing, and conducted deer drives, forcing the deer into a tighter and tighter area to make it much easier for hunting. And this, again, from a drawing from the early 1600s showing just such a deer drive. They hunted turkeys with turkey calls and water birds like geese and ducks with decoys. Now, hunting smaller and smaller animals required smaller and smaller points for the arrowheads. And so here you have a nice assembly of Connecticut points from this period and the smallest one here is a bird point. Now, that we come into a time where their stone tool technology was really reaching perfection. Arrows were tipped with these extraordinarily delicate and finely made stone points. They were fletched with feathers, attached with glue and sinew. The glue was made from boiled fish bones. And the arrows were made from a shrub arrowwood, and then the bows themselves from ash. Now, bows and arrows created powerful and accurate hunting weapons. Here's another wonderful point from Norwich, Connecticut. And they used stone as well to make sure that their arrows were as straight as possible so that they would fly true. These are two examples of arrow and dart straighteners. They act basically as sanding devices. You can see the ridges, the grooves. You would place the shaft of your arrow along the groove and slide it back and forth, and the stone is going to serve to sand down any bumps and lumps along the arrow to make it as smooth as possible so that it will fly as straight as possible. Fishing often involved the entire village. They used nets, which the women crafted for fishing. The women also made baskets that were used to collect eels. And as I'd mentioned before, fishing weirs. You'll see in the back of this image another depiction. This is one of John White's drawings about fishing, and this was done in the Virginia area. But there's another example of a fishing weir. And there were stone weirs very popular here in New England. This is the diagram of several different weirs that were found at the mouth of the Housatonic River in western Connecticut. And some are rush. So the zigzag are stakes put into the Housatonic River, and then with rush in between them. And if you look at the notes, it says 300 feet between the points, these stakes, and that these stakes are well over 100 feet long. And then also this diagram of additional weirs that were projecting out from the banks of the Housatonic River, and these are stone weirs. So stone that basically stone teeth that extend into the river, and they narrow the opening. They'll channel the progression of the fish and to make it easier for hunting. And if you walk through a lot of the streams and rivers, Connecticut River is another good example of a river to watch, I'm sure the Farmington River, at times when it is down and dry, you will find evidence of these surviving stone weirs. And then, of course, the Northeastern tribes farmed, cleared the land cleared for farming by controlled burns and downing trees. Now, the domestication of plants begins about 10,500 years ago. Corn and maize arrives in the southwest of North America about 4,000 years ago, and here in the Northeast about 2,100 years ago. And the Northeast proves to be one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the world. The tools that are needed are relatively simple. Hoes are made from sticks and stones, clams, shoulder bones of animals, and they prove very effective. Combination farming is developed. It's a technique that combines corn, beans, and squash. Corn plants planted first, beans next, so that the vines of the beans can use the corn stalks as support, and finally squash seeds planted, and as they grow, the leaves of the squash shelter and shade the roots of all three plants. Along the coast, we know that the technique of using fish for some time, in some cases for fertilization, was employed. And it made farming extremely successful. A 1669 document by an English observer described 6 square miles of cornfields surrounding an Iroquois village. A 1680s raid was described as destroying more than 1 million bushels, the equivalent of about 42,000 tons of corn from 4 different villages. And this is a hoe blade from Brookfield, Massachusetts. And they also developed methods for preserving their foods, drying and smoking meat and fish. They dried fruits and vegetables as well, all in the desire to feed their communities through the long winters. Now, they did not have metal, but women made cooking pots from local clay, highly decorated for such utilitarian and fragile objects. These are potsherds that were uncovered in New York and New Jersey, and you can see some of the incise decoration that was added to these clay pots. And here are renderings of some pots that were discovered intact, showing the various decorations. The collaring is very common. These pots are conical. They're suspended over a fire rather than set in a fire. They lived in comfortable homes that protected them in the coldest winter conditions. They slept on beds lined with furs and under fur blankets. The people were able to have heat, fires inside their homes that kept them warm in the winter. The winter lodges were built in protected valleys close to a water source, and records are that as many as 60 families could live in some of these, what we now call longhouses, but really communal living spaces. Most villages relocated before planting time to their warm weather homes where they had established fields and gardens. There they lived in smaller single-family dwellings called wigwams, weetus, but again, covered in birch bark or woven mats. Their belongings were stored in baskets made by the women of birch bark or woven or twined fibers. In the winter, they used toboggans and sleds and snowshoes to move easily and safely through the deep snow, and wore mittens and fur-lined garments. Now, they traveled using long-established paths and the waterways. These also facilitated an extensive and far-reaching trade route, a network that connected different regions of the Northeast. All up and down the Northeast coast and far inland, the people spoke basically the same language, Algonquian. Under that big umbrella of language, there were many regional dialects: Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Eastern Abenaki, Western Abenaki, Pakunta, Massachusetts, Narragansett, Pequot, Mohegan, Mohican, Quiripi. And within each of these linguistic tribal groups can be identified subdialects specific to clusters of regional villages. For example, in southern Connecticut, in southern and central Connecticut, rather, are the Western Niantic, the Eastern Niantic, Pequot, Mohegan, Pagusset, Tunxus, Wangunk, and Podunk. This is much like the United States. English is the most commonly spoken language here in the United States currently, but each region of the country has its own dialect, its own speech patterns. Each region has some words and expression that are uniquely its own. But throughout the country, no matter where you are from, when you speak English to someone who understands English, they understand you. Now, this common root Algonquian language made trade across the Northeast easier. Farther west in New York and parts of Pennsylvania, the language is Iroquoian, completely different. And communication between neighboring tribes of Iroquois and Algonquian people was a much bigger challenge. Art and decoration was and are in every part of people's lives, from cooking pots, as we've seen, to clothing, to their own bodies. Tattooing and body paint were common expressions of personal, village, and tribal identity and individuality. Combs were beautifully crafted from deer antler. Stone pendants abounded, some from Massachusetts and Delaware. And tribes on the coast perfected making beads from whelk and clam shells, called wampum. They were created using some amazing stone drill points. These points are from southern New England, were discovered in southern New England. The particular clam shell that was used for the purple wampum comes from the clam we now call quahog, which is the Algonquin, which is a variation of the Algonquin name for clams, pequahawk. The indigenous people in this time had a strong sense of community and community responsibility, which meant caring for those who needed help, whether that was taking on another's work or sharing food. They respected women and the elders in their communities, often elevating them to positions of authority. It's likely that everyone in the community contributed to make it successful. There's probably no way that we can ever calculate the true population of this region. Estimates range from 150,000 to 1 million people living here in 1490. But what we do know is that 600 years ago, Northeast America was home to a flourishing population. For over 12,500 years, 500 generations have called this land their home. And I'd like to, before we get into some discussion and question answer, I just wanted to perhaps do a little show and tell to explain a little more about sinew. I've mentioned that as thread. Sinew are the tendons that are in mammals' bodies. They connect your muscles to your bones. Without them, you really can't move. This is a deer's leg tendon. They're very long in deer. And as they dry, as you can see, they can be separated into threads. And it's this thread that is used for all manner of sewing. It's used to attach arrowheads to arrows and spearheads to spears. It's used for fishing. It's used to sew garments. So it is incredibly long. This is what I mean by is used. I'm going to talk about using the shoulder bone here. You can see just from the shape of this shoulder bone of the deer, it lends itself quite easily to being hafted onto a longer stick and used for hoeing. And this is the gouge that I had showed you earlier that was used for making dugout canoes, for taking down a tree. And finally, when I mentioned the slabs of elm bark that are used for the homes, this is just one example. It gives you a sense of just how thick these pieces of bark are and how good they will be at when overlapped, just like shingles are overlapped on the roof, how good they will be at keeping out the elements, especially in the winter months. Now, Andy, I'd be happy to take some questions and comments.
Gail, thank you so much. I am looking at the chat here. Now, I want to encourage people to use the Q&A if you have a question that you'd like to put into the Q&A, or to use the chat. And I believe that you can see it on your end as well. So, and I just want to say, terrific presentation. Thank you so very much. And let's see here. We have a question. How did they keep the long homes cool in the summer? And that's from Jean Johnson.
All right, so Jean, in the summertime, most everybody moved to smaller single family homes. And basically in the good weather, spring, summer, and into fall, everybody is you're living outdoors and you're cooking outdoors. So you don't have fire inside your smaller, think of it as a nice big one-room apartment where your entire family is living. And if they do have any fire inside, it's a small fire. There's usually an opening at the top of the weetus to let the smoke, and that would also let the heat out. But that's two different ways of living. There's the winter with the long houses with fires built periodically down the length of the longhouse, and then there's the individual family that's there in their own home in the summertime.
Thank you, Gail. We have a question from Kathy Machancic. Her question is, was the thread from the ligaments used to sew a wound?
It's an interesting question. I've never read, I don't have any information about sewing wounds. I don't know. That's an interesting question. It is very thin. It can be very fine. So I suppose, had they decided that sewing a wound together was something to do, then yes, I would think that the sinew would be adequate for doing that job. But it's not, I have not read of it being done, which doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Well, Gail, thank you for that. We have Jerry Hancock from the Avon site who is here, and he says hello.
He'd be definitely a resource that one might have for all of the wonderful things that have come out of that site.
How would you feel about having me allowing him to speak? And you can have a conversation. Are you open to that?
Certainly.
So, his question is, did you say it was a tool making site? And how far did the people come from in this region? So I'm going to allow him to talk.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the wonderful discussion and information. I just was curious of the Avon site and the use of it in how you described, I believe you said it was a tool making venue site. And so what range did the people coming to that site, the indigenous people, come from? Were they traveling as far as the mid-Massachusetts area, or was it mostly in through the Connecticut area, as we now have our boundaries today?
What I don't have that information specific to that site, but what I do know about a couple of other hunting and tool making sites is that it was they were regional
Right.
camping, regional areas, so that and they were brought, peoples from different tribes and villages came to that site in turns. The last I've read, the description of it is taking turns, almost like, yeah, not to minimize it, but it's almost like a timeshare.
Oh,
That's something that we can kind of identify with, that it's worked out who has which time at a location.
Hmm.
And and the site may be because there is a significant deposit of the materials that are necessary for their tools, or the site could be popular because it has such an abundance of wildlife resources, fish, for example. The Farmington site makes a lot of sense because of its location on the Farmington River. And also that whole region was very dense with deer and other wild game. So it's possible that it was also used as a hunting location, and that the men are there in particular making tools at the same time, because stone tools are very fragile. If they hit something, they break very easily. And a man is always making more. Now, that's his downtime is always making and replacing his tools. And once a point has broken or chipped, it's really no good. He's got to replace it. So, so we find that Tolland has a site like that, where it's a known hunting and fishing location, but also they found significant deposits of tools. So that would be my guess on that. But I think there's I would say, get in touch with the Avon. The Avon Historical Society probably has a lot of good information on that.
Yeah, we have a question from Darlene. She asks, would a separate topic on herbs and medicines foraged from the land be considered?
We're going to cover that in the Foodways Beyond Three Sisters.
So Darlene, be sure to sign up and register for that.
That's the last one of the series.
And then we have a question again from Jean Johnson. How did men shave? Was there some form of stone scraper delicate enough to avoid cutting the face?
They plucked. They used, at beginning at a young age. So as soon as the facial hair is beginning to sprout, they use very tight fitting shells, like mussel shells that fit very, very tight together. And they're just pulling it out. And as women would understand that if you over pluck something, eventually you get the root out and you're not going to have the hair. So they plucked. So that was a regular part of a man's hygiene, was to pluck the hairs off his body. And if a man is going, as a boy is aging, if he is going to paint or have tattoos, then hair takes away from the design. And so it's not just the face that's plucked, it's the arms and it's the body, to get rid of the facial hair that interferes with the designs. And then, of course, when you get, it's pretty impossible to know what type of hair styling was worn prior to 1492, 1490, the 1490s, when you're seeing like when contact begins. But we do know that men were, that there was frequently they were bald except for top knots on the top of their heads, or you've got the stylized hair through the center. And in that case, they also plucked the hair off their scalp.
Another question. from Jan Hassenegger. Did they use special techniques or medication for healing diseases or injuries?
I don't have good information on the injuries, but certainly on illnesses, the kinds of ills that befall us. There's a really a good amount of information on herbal healing, on the different plants that were that come from, that are gathered in the forests and the meadows, that have medicinal properties and were used for healing. And we'll cover that in the very last talk in March.
Another question from Jane Dalal. Did the people migrate to various locations, or were they settled by their agriculture?
So in the course of a year, you could describe them as migratory. They had the sheltered locations for their winter homes. They were in areas where they would be less exposed to howling winds, where these large longhouses were erected, and that often were in the same location year upon year, decade after decade, because they were proven sheltered areas. And then spring, summer, fall, they are moving then to their summer lodging. And it's usually not far away. We're probably not more than 10, 15 miles away, but at the most, but to an area where they have consecutive years have created the land for farming, and that is close enough for them to then move to spend a couple of weeks at the shore or at a good river for fishing. So they were not, so when we're talking about 600 years ago, they're not constantly on the move. They're settled in a region, and they would only completely move house to move their town from one location to another when they had totally depleted the resources in that town, or they had the area was considered no longer habitable from spoiling.
Thank you. We have a comment from Dennis Picard. There is a YouTube video in a series, quote, "Fishing Historic Places," end quote, that shows the stone weirs in the lower Westfield River.
Thank you, Dennis.
Another question from a guest. Why were the medicine people, Pauwas, killed by colonists first?
Covered that. We'll cover that one a little bit later. We are pre-contact today. I think that the answer to that needs to come with a lot of context.
We have two other questions. Kathy Machansik, wouldn't the hair on the body keep the natives warm?
Perhaps, although I'm not sure that any of us think about the hairs on our arms or on our legs as particularly helpful, keeping us warm in the middle of the winter. But the desire, from what we understand, and this comes from interactive contact time forward, the desire is for a shaven look, a clear skin, smooth-skinned look. One could make the comment that, there are many times when our, let's see, that we sacrifice for appearances.
Now, Jean Johnson asked, was there any beast of burden in New England, perhaps dogs to pull sleds?
There were domesticated dogs, and they were used from time to time to pull sleds. But the toboggans and the sleds that were made are surprisingly efficient. Most of the big heavy lifting takes place in the winter months. There are drawings of women carrying enormous bundles of firewood on their backs. They use what they call burden straps, which fit across the forehead and allowed you to carry very, very heavy weights on your backs. They're woven straps. And the neck's one of the strongest muscles in your body, and you're distributing the weight straight up and down your spine. So that allows you to carry quite a bit of weight. But there were no, this is before the horses are in the Northeast. There were no cows. And so no other animals were domesticated, except for the turkey, and they're pretty unpredictable for carrying things.
Well, it looks like we went through our questions. I think Darlene wanted to thank you for the presentation, and her heart is full after listening to you, Gail.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope it's given some food for thought. And this sets the context. This establishes, and it's really important that we understand about this flourishing population that was here in New England before contact begins. And it sets the stage for the history that follows.
Gail, may I ask you to make some comments about the second in the series of 7 that's going to be done on October 19th, when two worlds met?
And so in that, really begins the history of the earliest of European contact with the native peoples of New England, and the impact that the couple of hundred years of early interactions has on the populations.
Thank you. And of course, Dennis has saved the best question for last, or a good question certainly. Were there not conflicts between family groups or extended trading partners brought on by one group wanting to move into another's area? Is the modern idea of the peaceful natives all living in harmony a little misleading?
Yes, just like people today, neighbors today, there were conflicts. There were conflicts over fishing areas and hunting areas. There were conflicts over expanding territories. There were conflicts over wampum, for example. And there were significant conflicts between Algonquin-speaking peoples and Iroquoian-speaking peoples. And just, as I said, people are people. And there were some groups that wanted more power, more authority. There were occasions where the Pequots are a very good example of a more aggressive tribe that and some of the smaller villages and smaller groups paid tributes to the Pequots. The Pequots provided protection. They allowed the smaller groups to use lands for hunting, use lands for fishing, but it was, humans are humans, and hostilities appear to be something that is part of human nature. So Dennis is absolutely correct. There is no, it would be a disservice to paint a picture of bucolic harmony between peoples, between all the individual tribes.
Well, thank you. In closing this evening, I want to ask the attendees to fill out a survey that they'll receive in an email at the end of this webinar. And I want to make sure that they've registered for our next program, which is going to be Thursday, October 19th, when Two Worlds Met. And again, Gail, I want to thank you very much for your presentation.
It's a pleasure to speak with you all. Thanks very much. And if other questions occur to you over the course after listening to this, then please, you can email them to me, Andy, or email them to Andy, and he will share them. And I will respond. So thank you very much.
Have a good night.
Thank you.